Welcome back to the Kruse Elite podcast. This is Tony. I've got a special surprise for you guys. I'm super excited to introduce to the podcast the other half of Kruse Elite, Alisha Kruse. Welcome.
Thank you, Tony. I'm excited to be here.
Cool. So we're super excited to have you on. You know, from my vantage point as a producer of this podcast, I feel like we've been collaborating this whole time, but it's always been through Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you are partners in this organization and that everything you do, you guys do together. And I just wanted to give the listeners a chance to get to know you and what you're all about, you know, your story and where you come from, what brings you to Kruse Elite and to where we are today. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
I was thinking about this before the podcast started, and I was like, where should we start? I think the best place to begin is when I first got into personal training.
Yeah.
I actually went to college for a degree in psychology. And when I graduated, I was living with my moms, and I was mowing lawns because I was kind of lost on what I wanted to do. Because if you don't go into a counseling degree with psychology, what are you going to do? You're most likely going to end up in some sort of office job. And that wasn't appealing to me. So I spent a whole summer mowing lawns and thinking about what I wanted to do and researching. And I kind of reflected on the fact that my passion was really with exercise. I was a soccer player my whole life. I played into college.
What position?
Well, I was center forward initially. I played midi in college for a little bit. And then my career ended because of having a concussion. So,
I hear concussions are actually super common in women's soccer specifically. Is that true?
Yeah, I think really just doing a head ball and taking the head balls out of the air adds a lot of force to the brain and can cause just kind of like mild concussions. But we were playing our rival in high school, and there was a girl like 10 feet from me that kicked the ball as hard as she could because she was trying to send it down the field as far as she could. And it went straight into my head.
Yeah.
At a very high force. And I was like completely confused running around the field.
Oh, wow.
With my head cut off. And so that started severe migraines. And it also started my fear of taking head balls out of the air because it would initiate that headache like right away.
Yeah.
But I still tried to make a college career out of it. And I couldn't get through it with the migraines that I was having. So I shifted gears, but it was always that movement part of myself is always my passion. And so after college, I was thinking about that. And I was like, I found a personal training program online. It was kind of like a school program instead of a certification. So it was a 6-month weekend course that you could take in New York City. And that led me to New York City, taking that personal training course and kind of like discovering that was really the direction that I wanted to go.
Yeah. So where are you from initially?
I'm from New York. So
Okay.
I grew up in south of Buffalo, New York.
So no stranger to winter.
No, we actually grew up in the snow belt.
Yeah.
My college was in Rochester, New York, just outside of Rochester.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you went down to the Big Apple and
Yep.
pursued a career in personal training there.
Yeah. And I got started there with personal training. I also ended up working for the school that I went to. And that eventually led me to Boston, which is how I ended up in Boston. And that's where I met Taylor.
Wow. And the rest is history.
Yeah.
It's so cool that you guys are both athletes in your own right, and then trainers who have dealt with serious injury and minor injury, I'm sure, one after the other.
Oh, yeah.
And it's so clear in your work today, you know, that you've had to work through those challenges, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there's such a value add from that experience instead of just going straight to the books and straight from the education side. I mean, you came from actually doing it.
Yeah.
Which is pretty amazing. So tell me about overcoming that concussion being an issue that, you know, is traumatic force to the head, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like with applied neurology, that would be, you know, something that maybe you guys have tackled. Is it something that you work on at all?
So it's tied in, I think, on what I eventually worked on. My focus has always been on breath training because I'm what is categorized as like a fuel problem, technically.
Mm-hmm.
That's my background. Based on what we teach in neuro, I have all the signs and symptoms of somebody struggling with a fuel issue. And a concussion can be tied into that. One of the things that can really help with concussions is doing breath work because you're actually flooding the brain with more oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
And that can really help with the regeneration or recovery of the brain areas that have been stressed or damaged from a concussion. So it, every person is going to have different symptoms to some extent because it depends on how the concussion happened and how severe it was.
Yeah.
I think mine was mainly, it was minor. I wasn't knocked unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
It actually wasn't even diagnosed. I went and got MRIs and all that stuff because of all my symptoms. And they're like, your brain's fine. But the symptoms were there for migraines, constant migraines. They were triggered by light and everything. So,
Yeah.
and this is back in like 2002. No, it might have been 2000. Just might have been 2000, actually. It was a long time ago. It was before the concussion craze where all this education is now available on what to do. And so at the time, I took the little pill. Anytime I got a migraine, I took whatever pill they gave me. And that I quit soccer because it was a huge trigger. And there wasn't much recovery that I did after that until really I got into the neuro stuff. But at that point, my focus was more on my health.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't so much focused on the concussion rehab specifically.
So did the migraines subside or did you just get really good at avoiding the triggers?
Well, I think that definitely leaving soccer helped because there wasn't that huge trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think it was about that. I think it was about avoiding the triggers for the most part.
Yeah, because I wonder how many people have something, latent or something that crops up periodically, but they've just learned how to kind of avoid it. They've avoided that knee or that hip or that trigger and never really solved the root issue, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't until you got into applied neurology that you were able to kind of circle back and connect the dots and say, oh, this is something I could be doing for
exactly.
concussion.
Yeah, and vision training is going to be a big part of that.
Mm-hmm.
When I first got into neuro, vision training was super high threatening for me, so it wasn't anything I could focus on initially. I think Taylor has told this story before. When we took the first neuro course together, he was getting all like high payoff exercises, and he's like, I love this course. I'm like, I feel better. We're walking to lunch. He's like, I feel awesome. And I'm like, everything is threatening. Like a toe pull was causing me high threat. A vision drill was causing high threat. Like literally everything we did at the course was causing more negative symptoms.
You're like, this neuro stuff sucks.
But it was very intriguing because it's like, why is this happening? Yeah. And maybe that, maybe I can get some answers here on why this is happening and we can figure out how to reverse it. And so, as we dove deeper, I eventually figured out that what I was experiencing was a fuel issue and that respiration training was going to be my way in. So rather than using movement or vision training or vestibular training to try to solve these problems, I actually focused on breath work and CO2 training for years before I circled back to vision training.
Right, because you've got to find something that can reduce the threat enough that the other stuff becomes less threatening too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like peeling back layers of the onion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back because I'm assuming this fuel issue didn't just come up overnight, right as you were doing neuro training, right? So, I mean, is this something that looking back, you realize you've been dealing with, like even growing up maybe, or what are your first kind of clues that you were dealing with this issue?
I always had digestive issues from a really young age. I always had stomach pains, digestive issues. I started my period when I was 10, which is quite early. And I had issues with that. I had my period every 2 weeks when I was 10. So it wasn't a normal cycle. It was heavy. Yeah. I had a lot of problems, a lot of pain. I would not be able to go to school because of it. So all of those to me are signs that something's off hormonally. Something was off with my digestion. And so looking back, I can see that that's where it started. And then it just continued all the way. Honestly, I still continue working on it, but a lot of things have improved, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you got through a career in college soccer until your concussion.
Mm-hmm.
and then you shifted gears. What was your fitness like after leaving the soccer team?
That's a really good question. So, because it leads into how I discovered through neuro that I was having such a big fuel issue. I actually got so hyper focused on school that I didn't do much fitness through the rest of college. Kind of
Mm-hmm.
a type A person with school. And so I was working for a 4.0, that kind of person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
so I was not doing fitness during school. It wasn't until after where I was trying to like recenter myself, like what do I really want? And this is what I was doing
Mm-hmm.
after college when I lived with my mom. And that was something that I had really missed. And so I switched gears, and that's when I got back into personal training. Or that's when I got into personal training and got back into fitness. And at the time, I would say I didn't have much of a fuel issue expressed as like an exercise intolerance, because that's a big sign that you're struggling with fuel, is intolerance to exercise. So at the time, I didn't have those signs. But eventually, I guess years later, it was probably like 3 years later, I was really struggling with how I felt while I exercised. Like I just didn't
Mm-hmm.
have the energy or the stamina.
Okay.
And then as we got into neuro, what was happening for me then was I literally couldn't exercise because I was having like blood sugar dysregulation issues. I was like literally shaking after an exercise
Oh, wow.
to the point where I needed to sit down, and I was getting dizzy, like
Mm-hmm.
completely intolerant to exercising because the intensity was causing me to just totally crash. So there was a period of time there. I don't even remember when it was. Basically the same time that I was getting into neuro that I just couldn't do it.
Yeah. That sounds scary. I mean, especially considering like you had decided to focus on personal training and like use that as a way to like get back into fitness and embody that passion for fitness.
Mm-hmm.
And then your body's telling you like, hey, you can't do this.
Yeah.
I'm not going to let you do this.
Yeah.
That sounds like really depressing.
Yeah. It's tricky as a personal trainer too, because you actually have to physically do these exercises to demonstrate them and coach them for
Mm-hmm.
people. And so you're sort of adding to the fuel issue at the same time. A lot of trainers are over exercising because you have to, it's part of your job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's tricky. You're just constantly adding threat to your threat bucket.
I want to drill down a little bit on the in between here before we talk more about some of these solutions that you found. So it's really fascinating to me that you chose personal training as sort of like the vector for your career when you weren't actually like exercising regularly at the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's really cool. I think a lot of people come from it the other way. It's like, oh, I'm already doing this 24/7. I may as well,
Yeah.
become a trainer because that would fit my lifestyle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you set that intention to do that. What was that journey like? Was getting the certification for you like a pretty easy endeavor, or did you find that challenging?
So I really enjoy the school environment, and I
Mm-hmm.
would say it's a hobby to some extent.
Yeah.
I love learning. And so the format of the personal training program was very nerdy school environment instead
Mm-hmm.
of just taking a certification online.
Yeah.
And so it was honestly very easy for me to get into. I actually was taught by Brad Schoenfeld, who is a
Oh,
very
yeah.
big name in the industry. Yeah.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
this was even honestly before he got his PhD. I think he was working on it as he was teaching at this program. And so he's like a bodybuilder guy,
Mm-hmm.
very, very knowledgeable. And so it was very cool to be able to learn from him in the earlier part of his career before he got his PhD and is now teaching in colleges.
Yeah.
So that was an easy opportunity to get back into fitness with, someone that's so knowledgeable and in such a nerdy environment. It was actually, I had the discipline. I just needed to be in that environment to be
Mm-hmm.
able to get back into it.
Yeah. So it sounds like you thrived in that environment and
Mm-hmm.
you were soaking it all in. You had a great mentor, a very knowledgeable mentor.
Mm-hmm.
How was the transition out of the program into your own practice?
Got you. So once I graduated, I was working as a receptionist in New York City at the time while I was taking these courses. And so I was ready to get out of that position once I finished. And I did all the job interviews. Harry Hansen is a big name in New York City as well. He coaches celebrities. And I was like, I have to work with this guy because I'm a bit ambitious. So I'm like, I got to go to that guy. And
Nice.
get a job with him. And so he actually hired me to work in it was like a corporate office setting. So the business actually had a gym for their employees. And so my first personal training job was in that setting, coaching these workers after work or before work. And at the same time, Harry also owned the personal training certification program, the school. And so he also hired me to work at the school. So I was kind of mixing work between personal training and also sales because I was trying to bring on new students into the program. And that was in New York City. And then within like 6 months to a year of doing that, Harry was like, hey, do you want to go open our next location? Because they wanted to open another personal training school in Boston. And so I was like, yeah, I'll do it. I moved to Boston. I honestly love New York City. So it was actually a very hard decision because I love New York City. I actually prefer it over Boston. But it felt like that's where I needed to go next, just career-wise. And so I opened that school in Boston. And most of my focus at that point was on the opening and sales part of that program and not as much on personal training once I first got there.
Yeah. I can see, from mowing lawns to opening clubs that you have a mind for business.
Yeah. And it's funny because at the time I didn't even know I was interested in it.
Yeah.
And now I would say it's actually my biggest interest in what we do with Kruse Elite. I still coach. I still have clients. I love helping people. Like I will never let that go.
Yeah.
But I'm very excited about the business part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Tying it back to your fitness journey, if you will, you're working mostly in sales at this club in Boston. Did your personal fitness take a hit during that time, or were you able to that balance?
Well, that was actually easy to maintain because you have a gym at work. So it's just, there's no obstacles for working out. Like you just work out after work. That part wasn't challenging, but what I was experiencing was a lot of pain. So I had chronic back pain and chronic wrist pain. And there was a company that was located just below on the floor below of this personal training school that focused on pain issues. And they were using a stretching modality. And so I was always intrigued by that when I'm walking by the door and I'm seeing them stretching and I'm going upstairs and I'm like, I'm not really training people, but I'm interested in what they're doing because I'm a kinesthetic person. I need to move. It has to be a part of my life. So it was just very attractive to me. So I started going down there for classes to learn more about what they were doing. And eventually they were like, hey, do you want to work here? So I ended up leaving the personal training school and working at this stretching studio.
Yeah. Was it because that was like the next problem to solve for you? You were like, I'm dealing with pain. My mind is working on this problem. And so like that passion kind of drew you to them. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think so. I've always been attracted to alternative medicine. And the guy at the time had tied in Eastern and Western philosophies. So he actually studied Chinese medicine. And so he was mixing and I don't even know how accurate he is, but he was mixing stretching and what he knows about fascia and channels of fascia in the body with meridians and acupuncture. And so that was very intriguing to me because he was also integrating things even with psychology. And my degree is in psychology. So those things appealed to me. And I was like, you can work on all of these things and help your pain at the same time.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Right. Very cool. I'm familiar with acupuncture. I'm not familiar with meridian points. What are those?
So meridians they're what some people they're like energy channels. That's what some people call the channels for acupuncture. So all of the points in acupuncture run along specific channels and are related to specific organs in the body. And they all have like a certain function. And so some people call them meridians, some people call them channels to describe those things. And it's even more complex than that. In acupuncture, you have muscle meridians, you have fascial meridians, you have just deeper there's different layers of channels essentially associated with acupuncture and Chinese medicine theory.
That's super interesting. So, this school, they're working with, the fascia and those channels, and then these kind of Eastern conceptions of channels, right? zooming forward with what you know now about applied neurology, are you able to map those to, I guess, the nerves with the brain?
Yeah. So, well, it makes me think of that question makes me think of a research study this guy did when I was in this studio. So he uses the type of stretching he was using involved resistance. So you weren't just passively stretching at end range. You were actually, the person was actively resisting the stretch through a range of motion. And one of my first experiences was being confused about the results that you were supposed to be getting from stretching, which were supposed
Mm-hmm.
to be positive, was this guy did a research study on all the trainers in the studio. And he was using a specific stretch and measuring changes in range of motion. I can't even remember the instrument you used, but some instrument was measuring range of motion.
Mm-hmm.
And myself and one other person got a negative range of motion result.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very confusing for everybody because nobody knows about neurology and that that's actually possible.
Right.
And so I don't even remember your original question, but
yeah. So I guess I'm wondering, like, you have these meridians and these channels from Eastern medicine. Like, now that you've studied applied neurology, can you sort of make sense of those from a neurological perspective? Do they map in the same way that you would think about it with applied neurology, or are they still sort of outside of that field?
No, it's not outside of it. To be honest with you, I think acupuncturists are actually one of the best applied neurology workers because you have that they're working at a receptor level, they're working at a central nervous system level, brainstem level when you do acupuncture. So, there's different types of senses that your receptors are sensing, and there's different tools in acupuncture that you're using that hit those different senses. And then on a deeper level, there's some debate in the acupuncture world about what qi is and what energy is and what you're actually doing when you stimulate an acupuncture point. And the modern world will say that it's energy, but the classical world actually describes it very much as neurology. And there's actually someone who teaches this very well. What he is teaching is that the acupuncture point is actually the location of a neurovascular bundle. So it's a spot that is easily accessible to get close to the nerve or a blood vessel, and that you're getting some sort of sympathetic or parasympathetic effect from that acupuncture point. And so really they're working at the brainstem level. When you do acupuncture, you're just not fully aware of that unless you've studied applied neurology.
Yeah, no, that was my suspicion, but I wasn't sure if it tied that closely or not with applied neurology.
Yeah. There's someone who does a really good job. I mean, he's interpreting classical Chinese texts from 3,000 years ago and explaining how that language ties in to neurology. It's very cool.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. I do think the appeal of these other philosophies, some of them thousands of years old. I know there's like a yoga kind of tradition as well that can really unlock some cool stuff that Taylor's talked about in terms of the parasympathetic response and breathing with stretching in certain directions. And it's really cool to hear kind of this like Western scientific understanding of what people understood thousands of years ago through a different framework,
Yeah, exactly.
And in some ways, what I've learned is, yes, we're learning about nerve endings and where they attach to the brainstem, and there's all these things. But when we really talk about like what's going on in the body, a lot of times it seems like, it really is about the inputs and the outputs and what's going on inside. Yeah, we have a framework for it, but that's not actually the most important thing. The most important thing is when you assess what happens. When you do that stretch and you regress and it makes it worse, like that's the information you need to know first, not necessarily everything that connects in your body from point A to point B, right? At least at my level of understanding, that's kind of how I've been able to engage with it.
Yeah. It's honestly the most approachable part about neurology because you don't have to know detailed neurology to practice it. As long as you know to assess it, you can use that information to improve your health.
Yeah.
And I think when people first get into learning neurology, they get very overwhelmed. It's very overwhelming. You have to study it for years and over and over and over, and you have to hear the same things over and over and over. You have to apply it to get that experience. But the most approachable part about it is literally just, did it assess better? And if it did, keep doing it.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So you're at this studio where they're mixing in classical Eastern philosophy with stretching and kind of Western practices in stretching. Where did that lead you next?
So that's actually when I met Taylor. I was at the end. So this was not the best environment. The leader was, so when I gave you that example of getting a worse range of motion, that person was very abusive and said that he tries to attack your psychology. So he used that information that he was studying as a weapon, essentially.
So to like blame you for it, essentially?
Because he wanted that research to show that his method of stretching was the most effective.
Sure.
And so when something doesn't go his way, if someone doesn't get the result that he thinks you should, he would attack your psychology. It was a very not good environment. So I had eventually reached the end of dealing with that and decided to leave. But it was just a few months before that Taylor came in to the studio to learn about the stretching through a friend. And so we spent a few months together getting to know each other there, and then stayed in touch after I decided to leave the studio. And that is eventually how we ended up dating. And
who asked who?
Who has to? We were friends. So
that's awesome.
I just remember when I left the studio, we actually, one of the first times I could tell we were both interested in each other was New Year's Eve that year. And then from then on, we just kept hanging out as friends. And then eventually it was just like, we like each other. So
that's
let's
awesome.
date. Yeah.
That's so cool. What a power couple, man. So you guys left you left the stretching studio, and then where did you go?
So I actually decided I was taking some of those stretching methods and training clients on my own. I got a job at a local gym and was also working out of my apartment. So I was just taking whatever clients I could get. And at the same time, Taylor was doing that in the suburbs as well as still going to the studio. He only stayed in that studio a few more months after I left. And we actually have a client. So this is how we started working together. Taylor thought this person that he was training should work with me on some of the stretching stuff because he was still kind of learning it. And so he sent her to me, and she came to my apartment in Boston to get stretched. And we started coordinating with each other on helping this person. And she actually is still my client to this day, which is really cool. She's one of my favorite people to work with. But that is how Taylor and I started coordinating together business-wise with one shared client. And then eventually we were like, we should just do this together. And so we got a studio out in the suburbs of Boston and took clients there.
Yeah. And then were your specialties kind of different? Like what was because you said that like you were kind of handling that stretching, that active stretching stuff that he wasn't doing. So was that kind of how it played out? Yeah. Like how did you guys split up your services?
So at that point, Taylor was experienced enough with the stretching to include that in his training. I can't remember if he was actually personal training clients at the same time. I think he may have been. He was also still coaching people in the water. So the first gym that we worked out of actually had a pool there. And so he was doing water classes and private clients in the gym there. So we were kind of just like mixing our services. I was mostly stretching people at that point because I still felt like it was helping to some extent. But I think Taylor shared, eventually we opened a studio in Acton, Massachusetts. And below that studio was a chiropractic center. And the chiropractor there saw what we were doing. And he's like, it's really cool. Like your clients are so happy when they leave the studio. Can I make a suggestion? And he started making suggestions about like, trying to get the person to be in a position that was more related to what their issue was. Like maybe stretching people lying down all the time isn't going to have that translation when they stand up. You know what I mean?
Right.
So he just started sort of like mentoring us a little bit. And he eventually shared that the neuro courses that he was actually an instructor for were coming to town. And that's eventually how we got into the neuro courses together.
Yeah. Yeah. It all feels very serendipitous as you tell the kind of longer arc of it. Like it feels
Yeah.
like one thing just led to the next thing in such a nice way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really feels that way.
Yeah. I think it was Z Health that Taylor talks about. That was the
Yep.
neuro course. So you guys started
Mm-hmm.
getting into that, and that's when you knew like this is the way forward.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I was also a little bit lost at the time. We were trying to find a sense of direction because we knew we wanted to help people with pain, but we knew the stretching thing it wasn't permanently solving people's problems. It was making
Right.
them feel good in the moment. And so we needed more information. We found the neuro courses, but at the same time, I had been researching going to school for acupuncture.
Mm-hmm.
And so I actually took my graduate program in acupuncture at the same time as taking these e-health courses, which I don't recommend. It was insane. It was a lot of information.
Yeah.
And I also had this internal battle the whole time because I'm learning about this assess reassess process, but I'm learning about these like theories in acupuncture where they're not necessarily doing that or even knowing
Mm-hmm.
that you should do that. And so I had a lot of conflict in acupuncture school about that.
You're like, hey, how do you know that this is actually helping? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was very challenging mentally to get through that. At a certain point was like, why am I even doing acupuncture school? Like maybe I should just be doing neuro. But I really liked the Chinese medicine education. Like I'm very interested in the Eastern part
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that these people 3,000 years ago knew how to help people with these health issues. And they basically understood applied neurology without knowing about neurology. It was
Yeah.
fascinating. So I just kept
Yeah.
going and doing both while we had our studio. So Taylor kept working and taking sessions. We both did actually while I was in school. And then I'm not sure.
How long did that last? That sounds like an impossible schedule to maintain.
We had our studio for 5 years.
Uh-huh.
I was in acupuncture school for 3 years while we were
Uh-huh.
taking the neuro courses. Yeah, so 3 years of that kind of insanity, but 5 years of having our studio just outside of Boston.
So let me ask you this. You've got fuel
Mm-hmm.
issues. The neuro stuff when you were learning about it, like none of it was helping,
Yeah,
right? And this is how you found
yeah,
breathing. You've also got this insane schedule where you're trying to learn, 2 PhD level, I don't know if
yeah,
it's PhD level, but
basically. Mm-hmm.
2 very high level
Mm-hmm.
courses at the same time while maintaining a practice.
Yep.
I've got to imagine that you had some flare ups with issues during this time.
That's actually that's when I had the most exercise intolerance. I
Yeah.
actually gained a lot of weight. I want to say I gained like 30 pounds. It was a
Oh,
lot.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So by the end of the program, it was like, I don't even know what to do with my health. Like, where do I even start? You know what I mean? So, but I had already taken enough of the neuro courses and started seeing positive changes with using CO2 breathing. Like bag breathing I
Mm-hmm.
was doing bag breathing while I was in school. I was bringing a bag in my car. There was a bag in my car, a bag in my backpack. There was
Yeah.
bags at the studio. I had them everywhere so that anytime I saw a bag, I did bag breathing to work
Mm-hmm.
on my CO2. So I actually was, to be honest with you, improving to some extent while I was in those programs.
Mm-hmm.
I found a book from a woman called Kate Deering, and she has a book called How to Heal Your Metabolism.
Okay.
She's actually taken some Z Health courses, which is interesting, but she teaches all about thyroid health and how to heal your metabolism through food. And she even mentions things about temperature testing. And I think she mentioned temperature testing and heart rate testing. And you can actually use those tests to assess how your body's responding to food.
Interesting. Okay.
And so that's the neuro I was doing for myself while I was in school. I wasn't like, trying to improve my lower threat with like ankle circles or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was focused on like CO2 work and digestion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that book was a huge help in keeping me on track there.
Yeah. Yeah. You're just like a sponge. Like everywhere you go, you're synthesizing all of these different bits of information and areas of expertise. That's really, really cool. I would like to know more about food in general, because that's not something that we've covered on the podcast
Mhm.
as of yet. How would you describe the connection between food and applied neurology?
Um, so it's really about like how well your body's digesting the food.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting question. I'm not really sure exactly where to take it, other than the normal response to food is to have an increased heart rate and a rise in temperature, because that means your body's actually burning energy to try to digest your food.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
There are varied responses that can happen. So your heart rate can go down, your temperature can go down, and that just means your body's not digesting the food. It's not generating that heat. You're not getting energy out of the food you just ate. So you're struggling for some reason to digest the food. You can have temperature go up, heart rate go down. You can have heart rate go up, temperature go down. Those both mean that you're having a stress response to the food. So that can be common with like allergies and stuff like that. It can also just be that your system's not working correctly, and you're just having a threat response to the food in general.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when you use that information, you can identify meals that are actually getting your heart rate and temperature to go up. So you know that your body is actually metabolizing the food. And that's basically how you can use applied neurology in order to improve your digestion. Because the fuel problem is like, a lot of people, when we explain that they have fuel problems, are like, well, I eat really healthy. And I'm like, well,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you do, but your body's not digesting the food, most likely,
Yeah.
and they don't equate the fact that they're bloated or low energy, especially after eating, those kinds of things. Like, you ate good food, but your body's not utilizing it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So you can actually find what combination of foods needs to happen in order to give you that high payoff response to the food.
Yeah. A couple questions there, if you don't mind.
Sure.
How soon after eating are you taking your heart rate and your temperature? And I'm assuming you're doing it right before as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I always tell people 20 minutes before and 20 minutes after, because it's easy to remember. You can take it, I believe you could do it like 5 before, like 10 after. Like, it's as long as you're within that 20-minute window,
Yeah.
you're going to get an accurate response. You have to be careful not to test it so soon after like eating or drinking something, because you have temperature changes in your mouth if you're
Mm-hmm.
taking your temperature orally. So there's little things like that. Like, you don't want to be taking your temperature right, like as you're cooking your meal, like not right
Mm-hmm.
as you're cooking your meal, but like, you don't want to go from cooking to then taking your temperature, or drinking something warm and then taking your temperature, because it might skew the result. So 20 minutes
Yeah.
before, 20 minutes after, and you're going to get some pretty good information about what's happening with your food.
That's fascinating. And then, so let's say you have some food intolerances that you didn't know you had. You start assessing and you figure out what's working for you and your body. I'm assuming that that's bringing your threat down, like at a systemic level. Have you found that people are then able to expand what they're able to eat and digest
Yeah.
properly once you've done that process?
Yeah. So that's where I was going to go next, because at the time, I was the person that was going into restaurants saying that I had allergies and
Mm,
that I couldn't eat certain foods, even though it wasn't technically true. Because if I was tested, I think, for a gluten allergy. Maybe it was dairy. I can't remember which one. It came back
mm-hmm,
negative. I didn't have an
mm-hmm.
allergy, but I felt terrible after eating gluten and
Yeah.
dairy. And
Yeah.
so, to the point where I think I didn't have dairy I stopped having dairy when I was a teenager, because I had digestive issues that long
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
And one of the things Kate Deering mentioned in her book was that you can actually overcome those issues and reintroduce dairy. And if you're assessing your response to the dairy as you do that, you're going to be finding the correct dose for you.
Mm,
So
okay.
you need to find the right dose for your body to be able to metabolize that with a high payoff response. And so that's what I did. I started with like half a glass of milk. And I thought that would send me over the top, because in my
Mm-hmm.
mind, I was allergic to dairy.
Yeah.
In my mind, that is what inflamed me and caused bloating and all of that. But really, my body just wasn't metabolizing it well. I tested cheese also individually. So you can test those individual foods. You don't need to have a whole
Right.
meal to test it. You
Right.
can just test that food. And so I also test cheese at a separate time, and I actually got a threat response to the cheese. And so I started with just having a half a glass of milk, and that was it. And then I did that. I don't even know how long I did that. Probably I probably stuck with that for like a month. And then you slowly try to increase the amount of dairy you're having and testing all along to see if you're actually getting a high payoff response. And I did that for so long that eventually I have no problem with, we drink raw milk. I have no problem with dairy. I can eat pasta dishes now that I never used to have. I never used to be able to. Exactly. And I don't get the bloating. I get the high payoff response. Like, you can definitely overcome those issues. It just takes time.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that something that you were ever able to incorporate in your practice with clients?
Yeah, I really like doing that with people. I don't do it a lot. I just do it when someone's open to exploring the nutrition part, because it is tedious.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time.
And compliance is really difficult, I imagine, right? Like,
yeah.
It's hard enough to get people to work out, like getting them to control their diet in a specific way is incredibly hard. Yeah.
It's even just remembering that you have to take your temperature and heart rate at a certain time before you eat is, if you don't remember, then you're like, you don't do it or you put it off. It's also confusing because like you need to really test every meal that you have. And so I always recommend starting with one meal. So the strategy that I found that worked best with my clients is do breakfast, start with just breakfast. Don't worry about anything else. Find a couple meals that work well for breakfast and then move on to lunch and stop testing breakfast.
Right.
Until you have built yourself enough meals that you can have a full day's worth of food that isn't causing you threat.
And how soon do you start seeing payoff with something like that? Like, does it take a year? Does it take 1 week? Does it take one day?
It depends on the person. So some people it'll take over a year. Usually within 2 to 3 months, you're going to see some really good things happening. Like you're sleeping better. Like the most common result that I see is the sleep is getting better, or better energy levels, not so moody, because that happens a lot when you're not processing food. You can be really moody, hangry.
Yeah.
Taylor would describe me as hangry.
To this day, or
I would say it's better, but yeah, probably to this day.
I'm sure if I asked him, he'd be like, "Oh no, never." That's awesome. All right, so forgive me the diatribe, but that's just fascinating. We hadn't covered that ground, and you know, I think there's probably room for an entire episode to talk about food and intolerances and testing and kind of deep diving. But like with other applied neurology, I mean, you make it so simple, you know, it's just, there's all this stuff going on. Could be with your hormones, your thyroid, or metabolism, or, you know, there's all this science behind it, but really you have to figure out what works for you and assess. You know, by assessing, you figure out what works for you and then you stick to it.
Yeah.
When was Kruse Elite born? Was that the studio that you guys opened together, the physical studio?
Yeah, we actually started as the Movement Project. I remember driving down. So this is when Taylor and I were dating. We were going back and forth from the suburbs to Boston, and we were driving into Boston talking about like what the name of our space should be. And we eventually came up with the Movement Project. So we started out as the Movement Project, and we were the Movement Project, I believe it was all 5 years that we had our studio, our in-person studio. And then we started to transition to the idea of being online pretty close to when I finished my acupuncture program. We do not like living in Massachusetts. We needed a way out. And so Taylor was very attracted to the idea of living up here where we are now, central New Hampshire. But we were like, how do you make an income in central New Hampshire doing personal training? Like, it's just, it's not going to happen. Like, he's even threw around the idea of like teaching at the schools and stuff like that. But we were also learning about having an online business at that time. So we decided to transition online. And that is when we changed our name to Kruse Elite, because everybody back at that time was having the Movement Project, the November Project. There was like all these business names. There was tons of people that were calling themselves the Movement Project. It didn't stand out enough. And so we decided to go back to Taylor's original business name, which was Kruse Elite. He was Kruse Elite before I existed.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, you existed, but you weren't at Kruse Elite.
Yeah, exactly. Before I was in the picture, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And what was it like transitioning from being mostly in person to online?
So that was interesting because it was a hard transition. We, at the time, had a membership, which is really interesting. I don't think Taylor's mentioned this before, but we had a membership, and it was a huge challenge because at the time, Taylor was still getting really comfortable with filming. Now he can go in and he can just talk and film and coach, and there's
Mm-hmm.
like no mistakes. He's like, no
Yeah.
notes, no mistakes. He's just coaches.
He's yeah, he's very impressive. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. And at the beginning, when he was trying to learn how to be on video and coach these things on video, it would take us hours to shoot
Mm,
videos. It was very challenging, but we had an online membership and we enjoyed that, but it wasn't formatted in a way that we enjoyed. So it was like a drip feed. They got one lesson a week. We had to film them every week. It was super high stress because we were still having challenges filming at an efficient rate.
mm-hmm.
And so that was our initial experience online. We actually had some good interest. Like we were happy with the numbers that we had, but it became not sustainable. At this point, we moved up to New Hampshire. And that was when COVID happened, we actually were losing a lot of members because our focus was with personal trainers and everybody's losing their jobs in COVID because of
Right.
not being able to do in-person training. So our membership started going down and we just decided to do more sessions to make up the income. But at that point, we were just trying to figure out how to have an online business. So we just kept thinking
Yeah.
through and problem solving that to what it is now, basically.
Yeah, iterating on the concept, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How is the because in person you're getting so much feedback from just their attitude, their body, their posture.
Mm-hmm.
How is taking that to an online setting? What were some of the challenges there?
So the main challenge is like, I'm a kinesthetic person. So like when we're coaching, it's like, it's nice to be physical
Mm-hmm.
and move and demonstrate. And that takes that away. So we're mainly sitting in a chair on Zoom now, which is not
Yeah.
as exciting. I do prefer in-person sessions over Zoom sessions.
Yeah.
You also you can use applied neurology. We still do it, but it's not as easy as just like us directing a vision drill. You have to do a lot more verbal coaching, and that is very
Mm-hmm.
challenging. We can't do sensory work unless we teach the person how to do that. And then they have to find all these sensory tools in their house. Whereas when we're in person, we have literally toolkits of sensory tools to use at our fingertips. So it changed the way we work with people, but it's interesting because we also integrated back into more personal training, more traditional fitness, because one thing that happened when we were first getting into applied neurology is we went like way applied neurology and kind
Mm-hmm.
of left out the fitness part. But it's such a key component for someone's health that you can't not strength train. You can't not do mobility.
Right.
You can't just do neurology and do all these like magic hacks and expect your health to get better. Like it has to be a combination of those two things. And so I think that facing that challenge and reintegrating more personal training on our online sessions helped shape the way that we decided to structure our current membership.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I view it as sort of like a foundational pillar, right? It's like sleep, some sort of training, strength training or fitness, some sort of cardio
Mm-hmm.
training, right? Like food, these are like essential blocks to like just being a healthy human being, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so if you're just ignoring one of those, you're probably not going to have optimal health and results, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You need those foundations.
Just curious, what's your list of foundations then? If you
So
had
I
to,
strength train. You mean like what do I do for my own personal practice?
yeah, I was gonna say generally, but yeah, no, let's hear yours specifically. I love that.
Yeah, so I strength train. I follow a strength dojo program
Nice.
currently 3 times a week. I'm finally back to 3 times a week. I had to take a step back to 2 a week because our stress levels were just insane the last year.
Yeah.
So I cut back on training a little bit. I cut back on hiking and everything. But so I'm strength training 3 times a week. I do mobility and vision training every day. Sometimes, honestly, like 4 times a day. I do my vision training a lot right now because
Wow.
I'm finally at that point where I can take advantage of what vision training can offer.
Uh huh.
And so I'm really hammering that. getting back into hiking again, my stamina is a little better. So those, for me, those are my, like, I have to have my neuro routine.
Mm-hmm.
I have to strength train, and then I have to do hiking because it's just like, that's kind of the way I meditate in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm always focused on like trying to figure out my sleep, especially recovering as a parent, I'm not a new
Yeah.
parent anymore. I guess I'm 4 years in now, but it still feels,
Yes. You're still doing it for the first time, you know?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, a lot of my friends who have had kids, the overwhelming comment is they were like, "Yeah, like you don't sleep at all, like for like the delivery and like going to the hospital and stuff. It's just like days of not sleeping, and then you just don't sleep at all for another like
Yeah,
year, 2 years. Like,
it's brutal. And you can't
yeah,
prepare for it. Like if you can know that that's going to happen and you have no idea until you're actually in it, but you survive. It's
yeah,
challenging.
yeah." So by the time you became a mother, you
Hmm.
had already done the work and learning about applied neurology, right? Like
Hmm.
you had pretty
Yeah.
much. So you had some tools to understand, like, yeah, I'm not sleeping as much, so maybe I shouldn't be working out as much, or,
Hmm.
you know, suddenly things aren't that used to work for you aren't working. Were there any specific challenges that came out of that you had to solve?
So for me, that's when I had a C-section. It was a brutal labor. I was in labor for like 5 days. It eventually we had an emergency C-section because my daughter's heart rate dropped during labor.
Oh, yeah,
Um, it was scary. So it's not what I wanted. I wanted a vaginal birth, but I now have to deal with this major surgery. And that is when I really, so about 6 months after, I couldn't exercise for that whole recovery period. I would say for like 6 months, I wasn't doing anything except walking and hiking. We were hiking a lot
yeah,
and doing like breathing drills. And then about 6 months in, I was like, I have to strength train because I have this C-section scar and I just feel so unstable. I threw my back out, I think like 6 months in. And so that's when I kind of became recommitted to strength training. And
mm-hmm.
that has been a huge deal. I haven't done a ton of recovery on the C-section scar. I have some nerve like loss there, like sensation loss.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, based on the time that I have available to take care of myself, I find that strength training is the most important because that C-section, they go through like 7 layers of tissue.
Yeah.
And so I have found that if I just stay current with my strength or stay strong, I don't have any issue. I haven't had any pain issues since that first 6 months after labor. So,
I think that's really good for a lot of people to hear, because I do think that some, not for everybody, but for some people, like strength training is kind of the last priority on the list.
mhm.
And I can imagine, not just in this situation, but in many situations around injury or pain, how just being stronger and strengthening the tissues around the injury could be really beneficial to someone's quality of life.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
What's your favorite lift?
Oh, so I actually don't prefer main lifts that most people are familiar with.
Yeah.
I really love the contralateral drills that we do in our
Uh-huh.
program. So there's a lot, it takes a lot of like rhythm, timing, coordination, those kinds of things. So I don't know if most people would even know what those kinds of drills are, but you're basically swinging a light dumbbell and
Mm-hmm.
trying to coordinate it with like, I don't know, a lunge or a step.
Mm-hmm.
I love banded contralateral drills too. So like pulling and pushing bands while moving.
Yeah.
So while stepping forward or backward, basically whole body coordinated movements more than like, I mean, I like to back squat because I like to have strong legs and stuff like that, but that's not as exciting as like
Yeah.
more complex drills.
It's so funny when you describe the drills. It's like, oh yeah, I literally see the reel of Taylor doing the drill in my head. I'm like,
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You guys have such like a library of movements on Instagram. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Do you miss having a cable machine from the gym,
So
or do
we
you get?
actually have a cable.
Oh wow, nice.
Yeah. So we have an at home cable device. It's by a company called Anchor.
Hmm.
We can link it in the bio or in the description, actually. You just tie it up to the squat rack. It just anchors right to the squat rack. So we have the cable. That's really nice. We do miss having, so there's some drills you can do with It's kind of a long pole that you attach to the cable. I miss those because it's a lot of like chopping motions. We need to buy one of those actually. We haven't integrated it into our program mainly just because it's not a common piece of equipment for people to have.
Yeah, a lot of people don't have it.
Yeah.
I was just curious because you mentioned bands and free weights, but when I think contralateral, the first thing I think of is like turning against that cable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool.
Cable, basically everything you do with a band, you can do with a cable. So
if you can dodge a car, you can dodge a ball, Awesome. So yeah, any final thoughts on the state of Kruse Elite today? It sounds like you guys have come such a long way, and it's been really cool, even for the short amount of time I've been working with you, watching you guys evolve and grow. I'm a huge fan and supporter. I've got a t-shirt. But yeah. Any final thoughts there?
So we're really excited about the way things are coming together. I think Taylor shared a lot on one of the most recent podcasts about the challenges we've had and how we're trying to get all of our content to line up. And we have this awesome community that has really shaped the way that we are delivering information. And we were afraid to share too much neuro. But between you leading the podcast and really taking us in that direction, and then our members always asking for more, it has helped Taylor and I to really feel like our mission makes sense. You know what I mean? Like our passions are aligning, and we have a community that is just like really excited about the information, and that really fuels us. And so we're just continuously listening to everybody about what they're interested in and using that information to grow our programs. And we're excited about this year because we have a new course coming to try to deliver that information in a bit more of a seamless way so that you can kind of enter into applied neurology without it being so scary and overwhelming. So we have a new course that we're excited to deliver to people soon, in a month. But yeah, that's it. We're just really grateful to have such an amazing audience that provides so much value to us and allows us to really do what we love to do.
Well, that's amazing. It's really awesome to introduce you to everybody who might not know you. I'm sure all the dojo members know you, but on the podcast, this is the first time. So we're super excited to hear from you, and hopefully there will be more of this in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. I'm really excited to be here and to share my voice with you. And if you'd like to hear more from me and from Taylor, we'd love to do some co-podcasts together and hear your feedback on what you'd like to hear from us directly. Thank you so much for listening. Please leave a 5-star review and check the show notes so that you can be linked into some of the resources we mentioned on the call. We'll talk to you soon.